Hey, good afternoon. Thank you all for logging in, and thank those who are also on the internet watching us after today has gone. So thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to learn about Black arts and Black figures and Black thought more generally. So welcome and thank you for coming. So welcome to another installment of what's called the Souls of Black Folk, Poetry, Essays, and Reading Series, brought to you by the Humanities Center here at the University of San Diego. So before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone here that our fifth and final event in this series, we will be looking at the Black arts movement during the Black Power era next week. And the speakers for that will be Dr. Angela Nurse in the Sociology Department, as well as myself representing Theology and Religious Studies. But today we have two phenomenal scholars who will be discussing the famous period known as the Harlem Renaissance, with special attention given to Alain Locke, the editor of the classic anthology, The New Negro, Voices of the Harlem Renaissance, published in 1925. So I will be introducing our speakers according to their order that they will be speaking. So first I'll introduce Dr. Corey L. Barnes. He is an assistant professor of philosophy here at USD. Professor Barnes' research interests are the philosophy of race, social and political philosophy, particularly regarding cosmopolitanism, and Africana philosophy. In his current research, Professor Barnes aims to systematize many different parts of Alain Locke's philosophy, for example, his philosophical anthropology, his ideas around value theory, and of course, his religious thinking, arguing that what connects the parts of Locke's philosophy is his underlying commitment to establishing a cosmopolitan community. Furthermore, Professor Barnes' current research examines questions regarding what race is, what we mean when we use the term race, and the historical development surrounding the concept of race. So it will be great to hear from Professor Barnes, who's a specialist in Alain Locke in the Harlem Renaissance era. Next, we have Farah Karapetian. She is an artist and writer who works on finding individual agency in the face of authority and loss. Her artwork is in public collections that include the J. Paul Getty Museum, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. Through fellowships from the Fulbright Program, the Pollock Krasner Foundation, and the Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant Program, among others, she has focused her research into the period between the world wars in the hubs of Moscow, Paris, Mexico City, and New York, when communities formed networks of faith and exchange, imagining vocabularies around race, gender, sexuality, and proletarian empowerment. She teaches at USD in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History, where her research interests inform studio courses like The Black Mirror and Self-Representation in the Africana Diaspora, Between You and Me, representing the self and the other, and an upcoming honors course taught with Alejandro Meter entitled Line in the Sand, Borders in Literary and Photographic Representation. She will speak today about the network of the Harlem Renaissance and some of the core questions that guided the work of this artist as they moved through the world in time and space. So if we can please give one of those virtual awkward hand claps welcoming first Dr. Barnes and then Professor Karapetian.
First, I'd like to thank Dr. Calloway here for the invitation. And I'd also like to apologize to Dr. Calloway because I don't take corrections clearly. So I branched out and I'm not just looking at Alain Locke. Alain Locke's in it, obviously, because I'm in it, but I've branched out to other sources, other people as well. I'd also like to apologize to you all because even though I have a little PowerPoint here, I'm a philosopher, and we read. We have these, and we just read a bunch of papers. All right. So apologies there. I'd also like to thank again Lindy Villa here. You are such a help to these things. You are phenomenal. Again, I'm Dr. Corey Barnes, assistant professor in the philosophy department here at USD, and I'd like to give a little history and philosophy of the Harlem Renaissance. I'd like to look at certain philosophical issues that arise, certain philosophical ideas that tend to run through the writers, the thinkers, the intellectuals, the political figures of the Harlem Renaissance. But I'd also like to capture at least, or at least note, I don't have a lot of it here. Hopefully it comes up in the Q&A, but some of the philosophical influencers of the Harlem Renaissance. So some of what gave rise to the Harlem Renaissance in terms of philosophers, in terms of philosophical ideas that have in some sense been rejected or overlooked, neglected, certainly. All right, so the title is A Little History and Philosophy of the Harlem Renaissance. All right, so the Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro movement, was a period in American history where Blacks produced artistic representations such as literature, poetry, sculpture, music, film, and art design that was centered in Harlem. But more than flavorful culture products, Blacks in the Harlem Renaissance produced rigorous scholarly work and rich ideas on political matters that all shaped Black identity, Black and American life, and perhaps perceptions of Black people in America. All right. We characterize this period as a as one of flowering art and scholarship that derives from a newfound sense of self and Black militantism and a spirit of protest. However, the newfound sense of self that brought about these flowering products was not created ex nihilo, but are the result of historical conditions that helped to shape its occurrence. Now, a staple of the Harlem Renaissance was the New Negro. This was a particular image promoted for the psychological disposition of the Black person who would come to possess certain drives and abilities. One might wonder, what was new about this woman and man? To answer this question, I look briefly at history and philosophy. I'm already forgetting my script. I'm supposed to be clicking. All right, so here we can just see some of the magazines that are a product of Harlem Renaissance intellectuals, writers, and political figures. All right, so in terms of history or context, an important question to answer about the Harlem Renaissance is, when was the Harlem Renaissance? Precisely when did the New Negro arrive? Though the Harlem Renaissance is said to have begun in the early to mid 1920s and to have continued through the mid 1930s, it has no precise or agreed upon beginning or end. The Harlem Renaissance blossomed in the 1920s and then began to fade in the mid to late 1930s and early 1940s, with no clear end date. Though a precise date for the arrival of the New Negro is not clear, we might trace her or his emergence to a few historical occurrences as conditions for the possible emergence of the New Negro and the Harlem Renaissance. All right, so the first major historical condition occurred between 1916 and 1919. During this time, more than 500,000 people, Black people, migrated out of the South into the North and Midwest. The migration put Blacks in greater contact with themselves, and depending on the location, within a more urban environment, where certain culture products were more easily assessed and that placed more of an emphasis on culture itself. With the migration came a blending of worldviews and both a clash and a sharing of culture products and strategies for racial uplift. The second major historical contributor of the New Negro was World War I. Blacks, after fighting in a war to make the world safe for democracy, came home ready to make American democracy safe for Blacks. And so Blacks came home from the war intolerant of the indignities and injustices that were rampant in American democracy. Historian Nathaniel Huggins tells us that, quote, by the end of the war in 1919, African Americans who called themselves radicals were already serving notice that the Negro of post-war America was going to be much more militant than his pre-war brother, end quote. The Negro would not accommodate or turn the other cheek to grievances. This Negro, the new Negro, would fight back. The third historical, or perhaps contextual, contributor to the new Negro was, as John Hope Franklin put it, that the Negro had, quote, achieved a level of articulation that made it possible for them to transform their feelings into a variety of literary forms. The overwhelming majority of African Americans just out of slavery had not possessed the ability to read or write, took little or no interest in literary texts. Just out of slavery, Blacks could not yet understand their power to capture the imagination of others in the world. However, by the mid-19 teens, many more African Americans and other Blacks in Harlem and throughout the United States had exposure to letters and literature. One might imagine that these had the impact on imagination, not merely in terms of inquisitiveness or creativity, but also in its use for social and political uplift. These three historical contributors give some insight into what is new about the new Negro. But in order to fully appreciate what is new about this Negro, we need to understand its difference from the old Negro. So what was the old Negro from which the new Negro departs and has emerged? Alain Locke, a figure who has become known as the father of the Harlem Renaissance, gives us a clear depiction of who, or perhaps what, he took the old Negro to be. Alain Locke tells us that, quote, the old Negro had long become more a myth than a man or woman, end quote. The Negro has, quote, been a stock figure perpetuated as a historical fiction, partly in innocent sentimentalism, partly in deliberate reactionism, end quote. Here, the sentimentalist has produced or bought into an image of Blacks as a simple, almost childlike figure who required white sympathy for her or his plight, without which she or he could not stand or live. The reactionist created or bought into a Simeonized caricature set up to demean and justify the maltreatment of the Negro. The Negro should not be allowed to stand or live, right? For Alain Locke and other Harlem thinkers, Black Americans would have to combat these false identities that even Blacks themselves have internalized. Locke tells us that, quote, through having had to appeal from the unjust stereotypes of our oppressors and traducers to those of his liberators, friends, and benefactors, the Negro has had to subscribe to the traditional positions from which his case has been viewed. Little true social or self-understanding has or could come from such a situation, end quote. Locke thinks that in response to these stereotypes, benefactors have defined the Negro's identity for her or him, and thus the Negro has not been able to develop or to find a proper identity. The Negro has internalized another's identity for her and him. It is for this reason that the Negro's shadow, so to speak, has become more real to him or her than his or her personality. And so the new Negro, as opposed to the old one that internalized the images of those from without, is she or he who works to discover or to define him or her self. The self-discovery, or perhaps self-invention, is the sense of self that is responsible for the flowering art and scholarship to which was referred earlier. The Negro who works to define her himself is the new Negro, right? This Negro. Locke tells us that, quote, the Negro of today is inevitably moving forward under the control largely of his own objectives, end quote. The new Negro's objectives relate to both his or her outer and inner life. there are ideals of American institutions and democracy and a new psychology. When thinking about the ideals of American institutions and democracy, consider Langston Hughes's I Too. Right? Langston Hughes writes, quote, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and I eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen. Then, besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America, right? And when considering the ideal of a new psychology, consider Angela Grimke's The Black Finger. She writes, quote, I have just seen the most beautiful thing, slim and still, against the old gold sky, a straight black cypress, sensitive, exquisite, a black finger, pointing upwards. Why, beautiful, still finger, are you black? And why are you pointing upwards? End quote. The new Negro sees him or herself as respected and as a beautiful American, worthy of all the rights and privileges of every other American. Now, philosophically speaking, there are several concepts that are fundamental to understanding the Harlem Renaissance. First, there is self-determination. We might understand self-determination as a kind of will to both be self-sufficient and autonomous. Harlem writers saw this new Negro as one who determines how she or he is perceived and treated, and determines the course of his or her life. And this new Negro would have the means to do so. Thus, Harlem writers sought to establish their own newspapers, where they voiced their beliefs, concerns, values, and interests of Blacks. They sought to create their own fashion sense, sculpt themselves in their own image, or as they saw themselves. And perhaps more importantly, Harlem writers and intellectuals sought to think for themselves in terms of political matters, endorsing and creating views with their own conceptions of the good life in mind. And so, self-determination was an idea that was necessary if the Negro was to discover or define him or herself. It was necessary if the Negro's art and scholarship was not to continue to be imitations of the work of others, but those that placed the Negro at the center of both hers and America's story. And it was an idea that was absolutely necessary if the Negro was to progress or lead America in a way that many Harlem writers and thinkers took to garner respect in the world. A second fundamental philosophical concept governing writing in the Harlem Renaissance is group consciousness. This Geist, if you will, is grounded in not merely a common condition, but a common consciousness that leads to group expression. It is a life in common and cooperation for the achievement of certain goals related to the improvement of conditions for Blacks and Americans more broadly. As Locke tells us, quote, hitherto, it must be admitted that American Negroes have been a race more in name than in fact, or to be exact, more in sentiment than in experience. The chief bond between them has been that of a common condition rather than a common consciousness, a problem in common rather than a life in common. In Harlem, Negro life is seizing upon its first chances for group expression and self-determination. It is, or promises to be, a race capital. So what Locke is saying here is that in Harlem, and for the first time perhaps, Blacks were beginning to see themselves as a people, right? Now, self-determination requires a response to poor treatment. If a group is to be self-sufficient and autonomous, then they will need to demand equality in terms of both their rights, social interests, and perceptions of them as a people. They will have to resist second-class citizenship, indignities, and hostilities on any basis, but especially on the basis of being perceived as inferior to any group. And so, insofar as the new Negro attempts to will self-determination, the new Negro will require self-assertion. The new Negro will have to assert him or herself confidently and in the face of injustice, seemingly from a knowledge that they are worthy of fair treatment that they are seeking. Now, connected to self-assertion is the idea of militancy. With militancy, we're talking about a reciprocation of violence and intolerance towards indignities and hostilities from whites in an unequivocal demand for social equality. And so, it is not just that the new Negro resists second-class citizenship, indignities, and hostilities, but the new Negro does so in a way that matches the level of aggression and brutality, right? And all of these ideas point to perhaps the most important one governing the work of the Harlem Renaissance, namely self-respect. The new Negro ceases to apologize for and feel ashamed about slavery. Slavery did not depict his or her inhumanity, and so was not that for which she or he should apologize. Further, having derived from slaves was not something, or was nothing. Let me start over. Further, having derived from slaves was nothing about which to be ashamed. Instead, slavery became something towards which new Negroes look back to see her or his strength in a way that produced wisdom and confidence. As Hughes says, it is a part of the reason why the Negro speaks of rivers. And as Claude McKay writes, slavery has baptized the Negro and has given this Negro, quote, a strong soul within a finer frame, end quote. This concept is also of such importance because the writers in Harlem understood self-respect as a necessary condition for social respect. Harlem Renaissance writers were committed to the idea that their art, scholarship, and activism would lead to a kind of social respect that Stephen Darwall calls recognition respect. Now, in a couple of my articles, I've offered criticisms of the Harlem Renaissance for its participants appealing to artistic and cultural development as a way of garnering recognition respect from whites, and have argued that this appeal has led to Blacks becoming disillusioned when discovering that we are not conferred a kind of recognition as fully human, irrespective of advanced degrees, academic success, talents or skills, cultural ingenuity, wealth, or celebrity. What explains this disillusionment by the Black elite seems to be that whites have never had a problem appraising Black talent while failing to recognize Black humanity. This is why Black art has become so accepted, while Blacks themselves have remained so unacceptable. And this is why I take a very basic aim of the Harlem Renaissance to have failed, namely that Black achievement in art and culture would humanize Blacks in the eyes of whites. However, hindsight is 20/20. Certainly, one can understand why writers and thinkers of the Harlem Renaissance would have thought that a fundamental kind of social respect of being recognized as fully human would derive from being seen as cultural and scholastic innovators. Now, these philosophical concepts did not, as many seem to report, derived from within the Harlem Renaissance, and they weren't created ex nihilo. These concepts, self-determination, group consciousness, self-assertion, militancy, and certainly self-respect, were developed both in Harlem and throughout the United States before the Renaissance. For example, Harlemite John Bruce Edwards, or Bruce Grit, appealed to each of the themes very early in the 20th century. Bruce Grit, a Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist who advocated self-determination and collective consciousness, founded a number of papers throughout the United States wherein he advocated for self-defense in response to violent racist actions. Bruce Grit mentored Hubert Harrison, who is known as the father of Harlem radicalism and Black Socrates. Though little known, perhaps because of his advocating socialism and atheism, Harris set the tone for all of these philosophical concepts just mentioned to take root in the way that they did in Harlem. Harrison founded an organization entitled Liberty League and a newspaper entitled The Voice, which were the first organization and newspaper of the Renaissance, respectively. And an overarching theme in much of his work is a commitment to a collective race consciousness that goes along with class struggle. Harrison's work and advocacy set the stage for the most known philosophical root of the Harlem Renaissance, namely his friend and then adversary, Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was a proponent of a militant Black nationalist philosophy of independence and self-reliance for Black peoples worldwide. Further, he argued for the immigration of people of African descent from the United States and elsewhere back to Africa. He rose to prominence from a base in New York City as the most successful mass organizer of Black people in the history of the United States, with the founding and internationalization of his United Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA. Garvey's UNIA had its own press, the Negro World, its own church, the African Orthodox Church, its own women's group, Black Cross Nurses, its own businesses and industries, police force, choirs, bands, and labor unions. And so these philosophical themes expressed in art, scholarship, and activism of the Harlem Renaissance had deep roots in Harlem history. Coupled with the migration, World War I, and advances in the ability of Blacks to express ideas, Harlem was able to give to the world something as significant as it did. Now, with regard to the direction of art in the Harlem Renaissance, there's one final philosophical theme that I would like to discuss. Historian Nathaniel Huggins has said that the Harlem Renaissance artists seemed to have had two fundamental drives: spontaneity and the indulgence of impulse. These were part of the flavor of the Harlem art scene. However, these two drives pulled in at least two directions that were ever in tension throughout the Renaissance. These can be expressed in two fundamental philosophical questions that drove artists of the Harlem Renaissance. First, is a Black artist's highest priority or responsibility to the work of art or the progress of the race? In other words, should the Black artist be committed to art for art's sake, or should the Black artist view art as a craft for the end of Black progress? And second, can these two be reconciled or reconcilable? Given time, I think I'm almost out. I will engage one if possible. Yes? All right. The first question was played out in a debate between Alain Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois. Locke's commitment was to art as either discovering or defining the authentic Negro identity. As Leonard Harris tells us, Locke believed that artists should be free to conceive of the world in a unique way, even if they are not instrumental for the purpose of creating appropriate motivations for racial uplift. This is so even when artists in a viciously racist and class-divided world. Thus, Locke thought that art must not invent a respectable racial identity, particularly if doing so requires closing artistic pathways for a variety of works. Locke argued vigorously against W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois's 1926 assertion that art both is and ought to be propaganda. Du Bois claimed not to, quote, care a damn for any art that is not used for propaganda, end quote. Du Bois, worried about feeding white prejudice by exposing the less savory elements of the Black community, argued that, quote, all art is propaganda and ever must be, despite the wailing of its pursuits, right? But Du Bois continues, I stand in utter shamelessness and say that whatever art I have for writing has been used always for propaganda, for gaining the right of Black folk to love and enjoy, end quote. All right, so to wrap up, neither of these two questions have answers to which I am completely satisfied. We can talk about that more in the Q&A, but I'll leave things here. Hopefully we can think through these both in the Q&A and as we look forward in our own lives, right? Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes. That was fantastic. It's so wonderful to hear you talk about it. And thank you, Lindy Villa and Dr. Calloway. It's an honor to be invited to speak in this series. Interestingly enough, I am going to pick up basically right where you left off, Dr. Barnes. The questions you just posed are really key questions for an artist and for someone who is working to frame this period, in terms of a network. So I am going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance as a network, and what that kind of means to me is that I'm going to kind of try to unfreeze what I see as some of the kind of fixed identities of some of these artists, and also this kind of very delimited line segment, which also Dr. Barnes worked on in his talk. So this is really brilliant kind of pairing because we're both kind of massaging the same issues in very different ways, I think. So here it is, a line segment, right? The Harlem Renaissance is usually described as a period of time between 1918 and the mid-1930s, from World War I to the Depression. It's in Harlem, one of the northern areas Black Americans had moved during what we know as the Great Migration. And so it's a line segment. It's divorced from context, both domestic and international, both in terms of cultural production and world events, which is absolutely, of course, not what it was. And the people whose work came to fruition in this period appear as if by chance when we learn this way. We learn of it as a little line segment, a few blips of awesome production. And if you think back, people in the audience, in high school, what did you learn about the Harlem Renaissance? If you associate any politics with it, maybe you do associate Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement with it. Maybe that came through. Maybe you associate the musician Duke Ellington with the period because he moved to New York in 1923 and began leading the Washingtonians in 1924. You probably read at least a few poems by Langston Hughes, who moved to New York in 1921 and spent the last 20 years of his life there, and we'll get to the middle part later. I'm positive you read literature by Zora Neale Hurston, probably her 1937 novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. She moved to New York actually to study anthropology at Barnard in 1925 after becoming a member of Alan Locke's Literary Club in 1921. And we'll get back to her too. Maybe you were lucky to study visual art, most probably after high school. And you may then have learned of James Van Der Zee and his photography of life in Harlem starting in 1916. You may have seen Aaron Douglas's design work, even if you didn't know it was him. And I'm going to throw in Augustus Savage, but I bet you never heard of her sculptures. And that in and of itself is a wonderful roster, but you have no sense really of when, and even that line segment, these works were produced, and what other than vaguely World War I and the Great Migration catalyzed that production, although Dr. Burns just gave you some very wonderful kind of historical catalysts. But in general, it does go into this kind of frozen category. So you don't know who influenced them, who was influenced by them, where their work went in terms of legacy. So you have no sense of really why you might rely on this work now, as others did then all over the world, and as they've continued to do. Life really doesn't work as a line segment. So, you know, history doesn't either. And these Black thinkers are the bedrock of a lot of your contemporary conversation. So it's now our project to move that line segment over a little bit to grasp the kind of hugeness of this. And there are many ways to frame this. This is mine at this time in the progress of my kind of research in Russia, Paris, where there are a lot of Caribbean thinkers, and in terms that really come from the base of my practice in photography. So let's start with Frederick Douglass's lecture on pictures during the Civil War, which were the first philosophical writings on photography, period. I'm talking all over the world, white, Black, Asian. He recognized within 20 years of the invention of the daguerreotype that photography provided the capacity for all peoples to represent themselves. So this is exactly what Dr. Burns was talking about, to set the tone as agents of the way the world would see them, self-representation. In 1893, indignant that Black Americans weren't represented at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, except literally in terms of the performative presence of an Aunt Jemima, who was making pancakes. Ida B. Wells made a pamphlet with lynching photographs and distributed them at the Haitian Pavilion, of which Frederick Douglass was representative, not an American pavilion, the Haitian Pavilion. She made the choice to use photography in this way to show why Black Americans weren't represented at the fair, because they've been so consistently degraded and murdered. Meanwhile, Douglass made a speech, same pavilion, about Haiti's evolution from a slave colony to a free republic, invoking positive Black history as a harbinger of change. His tack would prove kind of the thrust of the remaining arguments we'll see today, an emphasis on positive self-representation. In 1900, let's see, yeah, there you go. Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, staged an exhibition at the Paris Exposition of all kinds of progress among African Americans, driving home a kind of propaganda he would argue for, as Dr. Burns said later in 1926 in his criteria of Negro art. All art is propaganda, he would say. You choose whether it's positive or negative. And by the way, white folk, you could try representing your own struggles instead of constantly trying to reinforce, even with good intentions, how bad we as Black people have had it. Again, there's an emphasis on self-representation, write what you know, in other words. Alan Locke would disagree with him tonally in 1928, saying that art is self-expression, as Dr. Burns said, but not propaganda. But Locke obviously, in supporting Black thought, as evidenced most famously in his compilation of 1925, The New Negro, was indeed pushing a positive representation of his community, right? So we're talking about self-representation and a kind of a generally a flavor of positive self-representation. But I'll add 5 more texts to this list, which are slightly different from these. And they're important to note as part of this network in order to start to see the frame as not only a question of positive self-representation or self-representation at all, but as like a series of questions, which I'll get to in a second once we start looking at pictures. In 1921, René Maran published Batouala, a novel set in the Ubangishari territory of French Equatorial Africa, where he had been sent as part of his colonial service from 1910 to 1925. Was this about his experience as a Black man born in Martinique to Guyanese parents? He'd lived in Africa for 15 years and spent 6 refining this novel so that it wouldn't exoticize, but it would instead humanize its characters. He was very French as well, and he was the first Black writer to win the French Prix Goncourt, and he spent a lot of his life contending with the terms of national identity around Frenchness, brought Alan Locke to Paris, introduced him to Paulette Nardal, who would then translate The New Negro into French and try to get it published. He's very much a link in this network. In 1922, again, as part of this kind of creative outpouring of self-representation. Mage Mafuze privately published what he had written in 1900 and is translated as The Black People and Whence They Came, A Zulu View, the first book in the Zulu language published by a native speaker of that language, providing his own narrative on his people's history. In 1927, Zora Neale Hurston, our novelist from the previous slide, wrote her anthropological investigation, Barracoon, not published until 3 years ago, 2018, which is the true story of one of the last known survivors of the Atlantic slave trade. In 1935, she published Mules and Men, a collection of African-American folklore. And I'm gonna push one past the line segment and allow me this. 1945, Eslando Robeson, also an anthropologist, and yes, Paul Robeson, the singer's wife, published African Journey, an account of the people she met traveling through Africa. So guess what? We're still talking about a theoretical framework, let's say globally, in a network of Black thinkers of self-representation. The guiding questions of self-representation are going to become, for me, and I think you'll find this relevant to your own journeys, where am I? What's my life like here and now? Where do I come from? How did I get here? What's my relationship to that past? What is my history? It's really a brave question. And where am I going? How can I kind of change the world? So now we get to the C stuff. So to show you how visual artwork starts to address those questions, we're going to begin with James Van Der Zee. He was Harlem's resident photographer for more than 6 decades. And you'll see as we move through his images, his work is a present tense kind of address to the question of where he is, whether he's photographing his own family, intimate photographs in the studio, really beautifully lit, or documenting like a roll call of who did what and where, you know, the Christmas party, the swim team, the wedding party. Here we have Black Jews in Harlem, Daddy Grace from Cape Verde, who's a faith healer. I wish we could linger on these longer, but next time. He didn't just document though. He was an architect of people's fantasies, who they wanted to be, how they wanted to be seen at their best, at their most elegant. I love that quote. At their most proud. This is an heiress in Harlem in her apartment. He also photographed sites in ways we associate pedagogically more often with other photographers who are categorized as a neutral zone of photography, but they are white, and this is categorized otherwise, and that's something that's very important to talk about at some point. But this kind of use of text in sight is absolutely part of the same kind of formative conversations like Walker Evans, and at the same time, if not earlier. Sites, as we'll never know them precisely again. This is probably one of my favorite photographs ever. Notably, he served as the official photographer for Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. And fulfilling Garvey's wishes, Van Der Zee's job was to project a positive image of the association, to emphasize the strength and the social standing of its membership. Nowhere in Van Der Zee's visual record was there any hint of the controversy surrounding Garvey in the early 1920s, when there were many kind of quarrels, as with Du Bois and other kinds of public interrogations. But there were other people. I don't want to leave this just in kind of the kind of literal notion that photography represents where we are, the present tense, although it's more complicated than that. I do want to address other mediums, and there were other people working to represent the here and now. Augustus Savage, for example, was a representational sculptor who moved to Harlem in 1921 from Florida. She was doing exactly what Elaine Locke described in the opening essay of The New Negro, although she is not mentioned in his book. In Art and Letters, he wrote, "Instead of being wholly caricatured, the Negro is being seriously portrayed and painted. She was an amazing representational sculptor. She studied at Cooper Union, finishing a 4-year degree in 3 years. She was offered a scholarship to Fontainebleau in France, but the Alabama students who had also received scholarships noticed she was Black and the committee rescinded it. After that, she chose only to represent members of the African-American community. Sometimes supporting herself as a laundress, she was simultaneously commissioned to sculpt a bust of W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, etc., and her community responded by making fundraisers for her projects. She did go to Paris, though, again in 1929 on a new scholarship, where again, Paulette Nardal, who I mentioned earlier as someone who translated the New Negro, Paulette Nardal, who is a force of nature, wrote about her work. On her return to Harlem, and I'll quote from that later, on her return to Harlem, Savage founded a school. In 1932, she had the Savage School of Arts, which was the largest program of free art classes in New York. And in fact, her students included the painter Jacob Lawrence. Many of her works were done in plaster, and she was unable to raise the money to have them cast in more permanent materials, so few have survived. Most notably the 16-foot-tall 1937 sculpture, The Harp, also known as Lift Every Voice and Sing, which was commissioned for and was a very popular display actually at the 1939 New York World's Fair. It was destroyed when the fair was over because she didn't have the money to have it removed from the fairgrounds and cast in a more permanent material. This is every artist's story, but it's especially every woman's story, and especially every Black woman's story. One of the things I want to interject in my narrative and say about Augustus Savage, which like just fills me with joy, is that she is like one of the only women artists to have herself photographed working. I mean, all of the other women that I'm studying right now, there are no photographs of them at all. Black or white or Mexican or Japanese, they're like 2 women who are photographed. And Augustus Savage, she knew there's so many photographs of her with her sculptures. It's like more than there are sculptures left. Anyway, back to my point. Using her appointment in 1936 as an assistant supervisor in the Federal Arts Project, a division of the WPA, she fought for commissions for Black artists and to have African-American history included on public murals. She was the first director of the Harlem Community Arts Center, which was the most successful community center of the Federal Arts Project. And then when she resigned, she opened a salon of contemporary art, Negro art, in Harlem, which was America's first gallery for the exhibition and sale of works by African-American artists. She included in exhibits there people you will have heard of and whose works did survive. The gallery wasn't financially successful though, so she had to close. So Van der Zee and Savage are 2 examples of wonderful artists reflecting the present of their experience back to the community that supported them in a kind of an intellectual and practical relay. What you don't see in Savage's work, because so much of it is destroyed, is an interest also in where she came from. A history, not just of Black American life, but of mythologies that were just starting to clarify from the continent from which people knew their ancestors had come, or from places with which they affiliated. So Paulette Nardal is one of the routes to understanding this about Augustus Savage. She wrote about a sculpture of Savage's that I still haven't seen that drew on legend from the continent. But because both women's lives are so erased from the record, I still can't find it, but this is a description of it. It's a Black deity born of an imagination fed by African legends and stories. 4 women's heads carved from the same block as their bodies hold up the globe. This looks so beautiful, I can't find it. So there is a definite desire and a determination to have a history, says Arthur Schomburg. We're not just talking about the here and now, we're looking for where we come from. The prints you see here are by Jacob Lawrence, again, Augustus Savage's student, made between 1986 and 1997, but they're, so that's later, right? But they're based on an abridged narrative of the Haitian Revolution and an expanded collection of paintings of Toussaint Louverture that Lawrence made between 1936 and 1938. Those paintings constituted his first major historical series, completed when he was 21 years old. They're in conversation with where he began to learn about Haiti, the Trinidadian British historian C.R.L. James' The Black Jacobins, a field-changing account of the Haitian Revolution, published in 1938. So the accounts of writers and anthropologists are feeding into the visual reanimation of a sense of the networked relationship to history. This is a totally different perspective from the popular primitivism of other modernist artworks. a white imagination had begun to simply appropriate, or one might say instrumentalize, techniques from African artifacts, famously as in Picasso's work. But this work did not try to understand its relationship to the cultures from which the artifacts derived. And this will touch on the question that Dr. Barnes raised about, what should art do? But it is very clear, I think, as we continue, that there is a significant departure in terms of the way a seeking of history ends up affecting artists in different milieux. When you see the design of the period of the Harlem Renaissance writers and the illustrations, that were deemed important to include in publications like the New Negro, like these by Aaron Douglas, but even when they're by white artists, actually, because there were white collaborators in this milieu, you do not see African motifs instrumentalized to consolidate power around a system outside the matrix of its significance. You see people trying to figure out where they come from. I mean, it's also advanced thinking around design, but it is a seeking. It was possible for people living in New York to see African artifacts. They came through the little gallery of the photo secession, which is later called Gallery 291, where indeed many of the white European artists showed in the US for the first time. Like, Picasso was there, for example, here in 1916. You see a lot of masks. And then they came through again, other end of what we call the Harlem Renaissance, through MoMA's 1935 exhibition, African Negro Art. Both these kinds of shows, though, displayed African sculptures as works of art rather than as ethnographic objects, which is a question, right? They're on pedestals, you see them distanced from the floor. They are in profile, so that they're really abstracted. They're rendered as typology. And they're described, you can see this press release on the website at MoMA, they're described as important because of the impact they've had on modern sculptors such as Picasso, Modigliani, and Brancusi. And if you look at the list of lenders to the exhibition, it's all related to racial capitalism and colonialism. And they're all Dutch. So when Locke put those images in the New Negro, is he too only influenced by Africa as a source of inspiration for the progress of modern art? I think that's different. He was there at Tutankhamun's tomb opening, and he bought masks off of Belgians. He showed them to the artists whose thinking he cultivated on purpose, and he distributed images of them in his book so that more Black American artists could see them too. But it wasn't just through encounters with artifacts or books that artists found inspiration in Africa. For me, a question has been so often, why in design and sculpture are there references to specifically Egypt and Ethiopia? And here you get to see my line segment, which I'm just joyfully complicating. Part of the answer is, again, as with Haiti, a question of networks, of ideological affiliation. So you remember Frederick Douglass gives a lecture about Haiti. Jacob Lawrence makes paintings about Haiti. There's an ideological affiliation with this place because of what it means aspirationally. Yes, the tomb had just opened in Egypt, and Locke had written about it in an essay in 1923 called Impressions of Luxor, which is a wonderful essay wherein he centers Egyptian people in the archaeological process. But Ethiopia, why Ethiopia as an inspiration? Well, the Bible speaks of Ethiopia, and Ethiopia had managed to remain an independent sovereign country governed by a Black ruler. It had become a symbol for Black pride and calls for unity in its name date even from 1829, when Robert Alexander Young's manifesto emerged. And as the century around the Harlem Renaissance develops, you see colonial powers encroaching on that symbol of pride in a country that's run by and for Black people. In 1896, Ethiopia beat Italy off of its lands. That's our big red star on the left over here. Ethiopia beat Italy off of its land. But by 1930, after all kinds of shenanigans, Italy started building a fort in Ethiopia anyway. And as war heated up, France gave Italy a free hand. And in 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia again and took it in 1936. The Black world roared. If this is a question, where are we from? Well, 100,000 New Yorkers gathered in the streets. People protested in Paris and London. All the Black journals wrote about it fervently. about this loss. It's a loss of identification. We're talking about journals in Paris, in the Caribbean, in New York, in Boston, in London, everywhere. This was a call to arms. They've taken our symbol of our history. Langston Hughes wrote about it. He'd been to Africa, yeah, my beautiful chart. He hopped a freighter in 1923 and traveled around the African continent, but he wrote about Ethiopia in 1935 per se, because the question of where we're from is complicated. He traveled a lot, and I'm not going to go into that network here because obviously we don't have time, but this graph should start to suggest to you how much more was going on in the world to influence these thinkers and creators. You know, here's the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. Here's the Russian Revolution, 1917. Here's the Spanish Civil War over here, 1936 to 39. I mean, there are a lot of things going on that are influencing people as they're beginning to think. And as Langston Hughes, as an example, traveled, he addressed all of these questions too. In one artist, we'll see all of these questions again. Again, in terms of a network, not always literal and not always in terms of an I, but a we. Where are we? He wrote about the Scottsboro Boys because their fate mattered to him mortally, right? Even though he didn't live in the South. He traveled through the South in the 30s, right here, and he visited them. But even more than that, he's invested, right? Mortally. Where are we is a bigger question than where am I? Where do we go from here? People were always looking for an ideological address to their situation. Not only where do I come from, but how should I proceed? Where are we kind of going from here? So for Hughes and the singer Paul Robeson, Aslanda's husband, that question included entertaining socialist solutions. And they spent time in the Soviet Union and Mexico and Spain during and after their revolutions, looking at how other people handle race in the aftermath of really big change. And for anyone who hasn't read Hughes's memoir, I Wonder As I Wander, just cataloging the way that he looks at race as a question in all the countries he visits is inspiring. As far as this question, where do we go from here? So, you know, you might know these people for what made them popular. Duke Ellington, you know, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing, you know, you've got all these songs in your head, but when you understand the questions these artists were asking of their lives, you know, does it help to open up for you the fact that a less popular piece Duke Ellington wrote was a 45-minute epic about Black history? He wrote it in 1943 in the middle of World War II. It was actually staged as a benefit for Russian war relief. Everybody hated it. And he only played it 4 times, I think, as an orchestra, and then he like split it up. But he wrote about migration using sudden changes in meter and blurred boundaries between myth and memory, using musical idioms from slave labor to the dances he'd helped to foster in Harlem. And it's really, really worth listening to, you know, because, okay, there's my line segment again, because the Harlem Renaissance, you know, isn't something you can contain like this. You know, when you really listen to the questions, it's artists posed of themselves and of each other and of you. That's what I got.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. This has been exceptional. I've learned a lot myself. This has been very encouraging and my favorite of the session. So thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Barnes. Thank you, Karapetian.
All right, but I have a question. What I struggle to find in the Harlem Renaissance is you know, we talk about the representation of like African Americans by African Americans, or Blacks by Blacks if you're including Caribbeans in the Harlem Renaissance, and you know, whites by Blacks, you know, because a lot of the products, the artistic representations were from whites. I've never seen a Harlem Renaissance representation where a Black artist tried to represent a white person. I'm wondering whether or not you've ever come across one. And if you haven't, why don't you think that is? So like you talk about sculpture, you talk about, you know, paintings, you talk about all of those things, you know, And when the artist is Black, to me, there's a one-to-one correlation between the artist and who is being represented. And I wonder whether or not you've ever come across anything different.
I think it's a limitation again of this kind of like line segment.
Mm-hmm.
I really think history does a disservice to production, because when you think about, I mean, I'll just speak to photography, for example. When you think about a history of any medium, and we'll say photography, because it's actually really corresponds to this time period, which is so perfect. You know, it's all over the world. When photography gets invented, you see Black producers in Bermuda, in Egypt, in wherever, set up photo studios and actually have the capacity and the drive, and eventually, you know, quite a bit of financial capacity as well, to shoot whoever comes in. And so they're shooting, you know, in the studio, they're shooting whoever's there, and there are plenty of white subjects. I think that continues along the trajectory in terms of who gets painted. But when you have an ideological framework around a movement, a lot of times, you know, I think stuff gets edited out. I mean, Augustus Savage made a decision to only sculpt African Americans or African motifs because she was so angry at her circumstance. But that didn't mean that she wasn't engaging with, you know, white thinkers in Paris as much as with Black thinkers. You know, so her subject matter is affiliated with the Harlem Renaissance, even though she's producing in Paris, because she seems to lock into this paradigm. But I don't think that everyone, I mean, I also didn't show very much painting, and most of the artwork produced during this period is painting. But you know, if you think about like the Egyptian surrealists in the same period, they've got a community that's dealing with artwork and thinking that's come via France and is now adopting a really local North African significance and manifestation. So yeah, but it's not usually included in the Harlem Renaissance. So I agree with you. I think it's a fault, but I actually don't think it's a fact that it's a
right. No. Yeah. Certainly not saying it's a fault. That is not a criticism of the Harlem Renaissance. I just kind of wondered whether or not there were paintings out there, and if you've seen one. I would have liked to see, you know, sort of the imagination of sort of the new Negro, sort of, you know, directed outward in a sense. Just, you know, and I would have just liked to see what that looked like.
Right.
You know, right. Not that there's a fault there for there not being one. And certainly I do take your point that there's probably editing there such that we don't, if there were, it's probably gone for certain reasons, right?
Yeah.
Also, clarify question, Dr. Barnes, when you say representation of white people, you do mean exclusively visual art?
Yeah.
No, so I had a question about, it's not really pertaining to the main topic that that professor was saying, but I wanted to know when you were talking about how all of the female artists that you were studying, like there was only one who really showed like her face with the art and stuff, and I don't know, like that kind of struck me because I was like, was there a reason? Maybe you said I didn't really catch on to, but was there a reason they weren't showing their faces or anything? Or
because they didn't have girlfriends to photograph them in the studio.
Yeah.
It's basically the history of art, is that men had girlfriends and wives to photograph them in the studio, and so we know that men existed. Really, I'm being funny, but like it's actually true. There are a million photographs, for example, of Jackson Pollock, right? Because his wife was taking pictures of him, but it never occurred to him to take her picture, even though she was, you know, in the equal conversation around painting and abstract questions of philosophy. So it's a thing. And especially, I mean, you can imagine that intersectional issues around this existed in Black women's communities, wherever they were. So Augusta is amazing because her sculptures disappeared, but she's got these pictures of herself standing just, like next to her sculpture, or like making one, and I don't know what part of her head just had it, her legacy in mind, but there it is. And the other women I was talking about are the women I'm studying in Paris who have gotten in touch now with their families to try to find out if they've got personal photographs, because although their essays and stuff have started to be translated, there's only like one picture of their face online and in public record, and that's just no way to be historicized, right? So maybe the family photographs can fill it in.
Thank you. My bad. It might have been more simple to understand, but I don't know. I thought it was kind of deeper or something.
Well, it is. I mean, I think it is deep, but I characterize it in this kind of like casual way, but it is pretty deep.
Thank you.
So the debate of art for art's sake and art as propaganda, I guess in your opinion, do you think that there is such a thing as art for art's sake? Because it seems like that there has to be some derivative of thought, of ideology behind the art, I guess would be in my opinion. And then also, can it be both? It seems like Augustus Savage was kind of along the lines of both. She was, representing self-assertion, self-realization, self-actualization, but she is also just creating her art in the form that she wanted to. So.
Well, I'll let Dr. Barnes answer that first because he posed the question, but then I obviously have opinions.
So, again, those were the two questions, right? Which I will appeal to this writer named George Orwell. He has this small little book called Why I Write. And in the book, he says the idea that one can take a neutral stance on art is itself a political idea. The idea, perhaps, that one can produce art for art's self, or that one should produce art for art's self, may be just as political an idea as the idea that one should produce art for the sake of African American progress. While I really want to agree with Locke because like I like the dude, but I also like Du Bois. I'm gonna go with Du Bois on that. And I'm gonna go hard Du Bois on that. I don't think that you can produce art for art's sake. And I don't think that the two can be blended in a way such that, art can produce progress and you're still performing a kind of art for art's sake, or you're committed to both in a way. I don't know how you would be committed to both. But I think anything you produce comes from a kind of historical context that is going to have some political matters attached to it. It's like styles of dress, it's like a number of things that we do. We take ourselves to be apolitical on matters where we're thoroughly, where sort of this view that we have is thoroughly, committed to some kind of political view. I just don't think that you get yourself or you separate yourself from politics or from anything political to produce art for art's sake, as though like you're casting aside community,
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Dr. Burns. I'm also with Du Bois on this one because I think he's being more honest about his position than Locke is. I don't think Locke's being honest about his position. He's pushing a positive representation, like I said. But the point in my lecture where I was trying to suggest that pivot, the kind of like privilege pivot, is it's neutral, right? So if the point in my lecture where I was trying to suggest that is when I showed you James Van Der Zee's sites, his images, landscapes of Harlem. and they're like from 1926, whatever those pictures that I showed you. If you look up Walker Evans, same moment. And Walker Evans's photographs are positioned as formative modernist artworks. They're not, they can be talked about in terms of the Farm Security Administration, but it's not really a documentary history of American poverty. It's formative modernist artwork. Same pictures by James Vanderzee, and they're figured as culturally inflected in some way, and they are. But so are Walker Evans, and so there's this really strange kind of like scale, weight and consequence that's given to one versus the other, because this one in the progressive narrative of modernist history has advanced our understanding of what photography can do, and this one is Black history, and they've just segregated the potency provided to both, when in fact they are the same moment and the same trajectory. And I think the same thing can be indicated by my emphasis on Frederick Douglass as a pivotal canonical figure in photographic philosophy. I brought him up at a lecture I gave at Harvard earlier this year about post-Soviet subjects centering themselves. And I was just like, yeah, Frederick Douglass said this. I kind of positioned it in this post-Soviet argument. And this little art history grad student raised her hand afterwards. She's like, but Frederick Douglass is a Black thinker. And I mean, she didn't even know that she sounded like she didn't know what she was saying. He's writing photographic philosophy. It is for the sake of photographic progression that we need that work. It is art for art's sake on that level, but it is also, of course, culturally positioned. He wrote from a moment in time. He wrote during the Civil War. He lectured about photography as an emancipatory thing because he was talking about emancipation. So it's a question of the privilege of neutrality, I think. And it's important.
Yeah. I will say against Du Bois in favor of Locke. I think the portrayal of, Du Bois was worried about certain negative depictions of Blacks in artwork, appealing to novels where there was a lot of crime, Black people doing a lot of crime in these novels and in these works might sort of feed the kind of stereotypes about the criminality of Blacks. In favor of Locke, I think that I don't think that not writing those kinds of stories are going to humanize like Black people, but I do think that there is a story to tell about the complexity of Black people by including those stories with other representations. So I score one for Locke on that one, but Du Bois wins the game, in terms of what art is.
I think also on this point is the fact that a lot of the artwork and writing, in trying to figure itself out, we test this stuff against time to imagine whether or not it's true, and that is fallacious kind of way to look at work. When somebody's trying to figure out what something is, of course the language around it is going to be inflected with false, whatever. And when I look at a lot of the way that people are trying to sum up what Black art is, or what Black painting is, or here is an attempt to make work based on where I come from, a lot of it does kind of begin to bleed into this question of primitivism and exoticization that they're resisting at the same time. Again, in Paris, Jean Nardal, Paulette's sister, is writing about exoticization, and everybody's trying to work against it, but the language can go there. So I mean, there are things that are uncomfortable about looking back 100 years at the language and the techniques that are used, but the seeking, I think the questions that are being asked are very contemporary, and it's important to rely on them as steps, rather than thinking that we're reinventing that wheel every time we have a conversation.
So I just had the question, cultural appropriation is something that's a really big topic right now, and whether the clothing and art, how we've talked about how it's portrayed and how people use it, whether or not that's appropriation or appreciation. And I was just wondering, from like both of your point of views with everything you know and the history and all that, like how would you like where would you put that line? Like how do you think it should be determined?
Let me step back, and then let me throw it on Locke. All right, and then maybe I'll think of something while my mind is on autopilot and I'm talking about Locke. All right, so for Locke, after Locke wants to say that certain cultural productions are representative of a people, even though he takes cultural productions to be composite, right? So he doesn't think that you're going to find like jazz created by Black people, blues created by Black people, hip hop, he would probably say created by Black people. He thinks that all culture products are composites, but he does take these culture products to be representative of certain groups. They have more of the flavor of these groups. But for someone like Locke, once a culture product is produced, it is in a sense for the world, right? For the world to enjoy, such that you actually have a kind of duty to be cultured, and a duty to be cultured requires the appreciation and the understanding and appreciation for the best and most representative forms of human expression. You have an obligation to engage those cultures, right? To engage the best of cultures. That's a very early definition, a kind of Harlem Renaissance definition. He understands by the 40s that this understanding of race as this understanding of culture as the appreciation or the understanding of the best and most representative forms of human expression seems to make it such that the blues person in Mississippi, who really only is in, say, Biloxi or something like that, who doesn't travel the world and do all of these things that these kinds of people do, he seems to say that he seems to be aware that early definition won't allow these people to be cultured. And he really thinks that, local communities and things like that have something to say about being cultured. So he says that the early definition is bullshit. And he moves to sort of this later definition where sort of it's more localized, sort of certainly poor people are going to be cultured in a way that he could not argue for them to be cultured, given his earlier definition. Me personally, I want to say that there is something to the argument for cultural appropriation. So in other words, I want to say that cultural appropriation is a thing and that cultural appropriation is a negative thing. And that's a lot of that is not owed to, say, people, appreciating certain cultures, but it's owed to the way that certain groups will be elevated once they take control or once they start to appreciate the culture. You see, you can appreciate it, right? But I think there's something, at least in American life, where, you create a TikTok dance, right? And then somebody who is a little bit lighter than you, views that same dance, and gets the money, gets the fame, gets all of that stuff for the dance you created and put on TikTok. I think that's a problem. And I think that's what occurs, when we kind of have this kind of, you can say it appropriation or appreciation, you can say it in either way. So I want to say, I guess, there is something to what Locke is saying. When a culture product is produced, the culture product is for appreciation, and appreciation doesn't come with a color or a gender or religion or something like that. But I also recognize that society will award the benefits to people not on the basis of the creativity of or the creativeness of the thing, but on the basis of factors not related to that creativity, based on being white. That's just going to get you. That's just going to garner you more of the respect for having created something you didn't create, or endorsing something you didn't create. So that's Locke's view on it. I'm sure Locke understood exactly what I'm saying. It's not like what I'm saying is new. He just didn't write it. But I want to say that cultural appropriation is a thing. I understand appreciation. I understand that, but I want to say that there's something negative about it for that reason. Not that the person is being disingenuous in any sense for appreciation, but that society's gonna privilege them in a way that's unjust.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with you. And I think that, you know, with students in studio classes, one of the reasons, like the first class that I kind of created at USD, beyond the photo sequence, was the representing the self and the other between you and me course. And the reason is because I saw immediately how much everybody wanted to depict people other than themselves. It's different from appropriation, but it is this question of self-representation versus representation of the self by someone else or of the other by you. This is a real instinct, right? Like everybody's trying to work, even with very good intentions, on communities other than their own. And the first thing we have to do, I think that one of the real takeaways from this set of philosophies is the first thing you do is you look at yourself and you write what you know, right? You take pictures of your family, you figure out your relationship to whiteness before you start talking about Black. Like you have to disrupt your own kind of narrative before you start kind of just, you know, affiliating and instrumentalizing your affiliation with another kind of a movement, right? And so we look at first the self, and then how do we recognize what that kind of intimacy with the community, what are the communities with whom you're intimate, and what kind of access do you have to them, and how do you therefore translate how they want to be seen in your work. And then let's work on the other, because it's going to come up, right? So you know, nobody's ever just photographing or painting or writing about themselves. The world is too intersectional. You know, there's no possibility that, you know, even you know, Romari Bearden paints women, he's a man. So like, you know, this is intersectional. You have to understand how to look at and with other people. And one of the descendants, I'd say philosophically, of James Van Der Zee, you know, you go James Van Der Zee, Roy DeCarva, all the way up to Dawood Bey, I mean, with a lot of other influences, Black, white, and international. But the descendant of this thinking, Dawood Bey's practice is very much based around something that I call the agency of the subject, going in and asking them how they want to be seen. You know, and you can't just always assume that because somebody is something that they're going to fit in. And, you know, he wanted to take pictures at a church where there had been the bombing, the Birmingham, and you know, he's a Black man. He went to Birmingham with this project, and they were like, we actually really don't want to talk about the bombing. You know, actually, that's just not what we want to talk about. And so he then had to kind of develop this relationship with them. How do you want to be seen? You know, how can we work on that? And then there's a third category in my class, which is context, because you can have the best intentions and the best strategies, and you can be the smartest person in the world. You put it in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you can really offend people. Like Sam Durant is a sculptor who put up a very intelligent and politically correct, as it were, kind of examination of the United States history of capital punishment, made a sculpture for Germany that seemed critical of his administration here. But when the Walker Art Museum bought it in Minneapolis and installed it in their sculpture garden without talking to the community, the Native American community went crazy, because part of this sculpture depicted a scaffolding at which they had been hung. And so now their kids are basically asked to play in a playground on something that killed their families. So Sam Durant, smart guy, just threw up his hands and said, it's your property, you take it, you do what you want. But so context, as much as strategy, can really influence whether something is understood as, you know, something you want to be in the world. Should this really exist? How does it add to the conversation? You know, or is it just instrumentalizing your affiliation with something that you don't understand?
Thank you. Thank you, professors. Thank you, students, and fellow faculty who stayed, and fellow staff and faculty, administration and faculty who stayed. Thank you for logging in and for spending time with us.